Hey, what's up, y'all? My name is Dennis Heil, and I am diagnosed with type 2 bipolar disorder with severe depression and high-functioning autism. I've been living with bipolar disorder for over 30 years, 15 of which I spent undiagnosed. In 2009, I experienced a depressive psychotic break that led to my diagnosis of type 2 bipolar disorder. I would be diagnosed with autism a few years later. In my podcast, Bluntly Bipolar, I'm going to share with you my experiences and the hard lessons I've learned trying to find some peace and happiness in my life. I hope that by sharing my experiences, others can avoid learning these lessons the hard way. I'm not a mental health professional. I have no qualifications or certifications. All I am is a mental patient with a microphone. You can find Bluntly Bipolar at bluntlybipolar.com or about any podcast distribution service. Listener discretion is advised for heavy topics related to mental health, including suicide, self-harm, and more. This is episode 7, Finding Forgiveness for the Unforgivable. Fair warning, y'all. This episode is about to get real autistic real quick. So buckle up, grab yourself a snack, and let me take you on a journey about the word forgiveness. I love words. I've been writing in some form for over 30 years now. For my day job, I work as a freelance copywriter. I find myself thinking about words and the way they're used all the time. I even go so far as to occasionally look up the definition of words I use regularly just to compare them to how they are used in everyday speech. It's fascinating because it's like a giant logic puzzle. What combination of words can I use to accomplish my goal or the goal for a client? Am I informing, inspiring, persuading? How do I want to make the audience feel? How do I deliver the most effective message that's going to land solidly with a target demo? Especially with how imperfect words actually are. And why are they so imperfect? Well, because people use them in two ways. You have the literal definition of a word, which most people may or may not relate to. But then you also have the colloquial use of the word. That is, the way people actually use the word in everyday speech. Now, as a person on the autistic spectrum, unless I'm masking, I tend to hear words literally. That is, I receive the word and I interpret them exactly as spoken because I didn't pick up tone of voice, facial expression, or other social cues which may signal a difference. Consider something like sarcasm. If I'm not masking, I can't tell that someone is being sarcastic, and I often have a hard time telling through text because I can't hear the tone of voice or see a facial expression. And I can give you another common example, and that is having someone tell me that they're fine. If I'm not masking, then I will just interpret that literally. Now, I also tend to speak literally, which has given me more than a few headaches throughout life. I can't tell you how many times I've been accused of meaning something other than exactly what I said, where the listener found ulterior motives where there were none. That's because they are imposing their own experiences and emotions onto the words that I'm using. That's why it's so important to understand the target audience so you can interpret how that message will be received. So with that in mind, let's talk about forgiveness. Forgiveness is such an important word when it comes to creating peace and happiness, but it's such a garbage word for representing what we're talking about in the context of someone doing something terrible. Consider this emotional territory that the word is supposed to cover. Let's say I bump into you at the store. I say, "Oh, my bad. Sorry about that." Most reasonable people are going to shrug it off and go about their day. Accidents happen, and it's easy to forgive someone in that circumstance. But on the other hand, you have people who say things like, "You need to forgive the people that hurt you to heal." Now, the context of the word forgive is so far apart between those two things that they might as well be different words in different languages. Consider the target audience of the message, "You need to forgive the people that hurt you to heal." The first thing that comes to mind is that the listener must have been hurt badly by someone else to still be angry about the situation. If there wasn't a deep pain, they wouldn't still be angry. Therefore, it must be serious. Extremely serious. Traumatic experience serious. So what could that trauma be? Sexual assault, someone ruined their life, someone stole from them, someone hurt them as a child, they grew up around addiction or alcoholism, they grew up terrified of an unhinged parent? Were they abused, bullied? Were they left behind by a loved one's suicide or other death? Have they faced some other similar tragedy that has left them angry? Yet the word forgive is supposed to encompass clear communication in both of these examples. In the store example, that's nothing. That's an everyday occurrence. Unless someone has a lot of dip on the chip on their shoulder, we're just going to go about our day. In a more mundane use of the word, we would expect an apology. You do something wrong, you apologize, I forgive you, and we move on, nice and clean. But on the other hand, what if it's a trauma survivor hearing that message? Are we implying that the survivor should be waiting for an apology? Are we saying to let the offender off the hook completely? What does it mean to actually forgive someone who isn't capable of apologizing? What does it mean to forgive someone who did something so egregiously wrong that even the idea of forgiveness makes no sense for the situation? There's all these other emotions and layers for someone carrying deep anger, resentment, or sadness for whatever it is they experienced and how it affects them today. And when you do tell someone carrying that kind of pain they need to forgive to heal, what's the result? Does it help them forgive? No, it doesn't. As far as I can tell, it has the opposite effect. It causes more harm than good. It just causes the person to be more defensive. They feel angry and resentful because they feel like their suffering isn't being seen, they aren't being heard, and that their suffering isn't important. They feel like they aren't being heard, so they stop talking about what they're going through. Now, I'll give you an example from my own life, and forgiveness I'm still working on and struggling with, even months later. My friend Sarah was left with her sexual abuser from the time she was a toddler until he killed himself when she was about 13. At 7, she told her mom that her uncle was hurting her, and her mother's response was to beat her and tell her that she must have done something to lead him on. The uncle lived with him, and her mother left her home alone with him while she was working full-time and going to school for 9 years. And as an adult, Sarah decided to go no contact with her mother for a long time, and boy did everyone have an opinion about that. Mostly uninformed opinions because few people knew the exact reasons why. Sarah was constantly bombarded with messages that amounted to, you only have one mother. You should consider forgiving her for whatever she did so you could have a relationship. I don't think I ever saw anyone consider whether or not her mother was worth having a relationship with, or what must have happened for a grown adult woman to want to go no contact with her mother. That's not a decision that the average person just makes for no reason. There's a reason, and it's probably fucking awful. Sarah was in and out of psych offices all her life. She had been off and on numerous medications and went through several therapists until she finally decided to end her own life in her mid-40s, largely driven by the mental disorders that resulted from those experiences. Does the word forgiveness sound applicable to this situation? What about acceptance? How can you forgive your mother for doing something like that? Does the mother even deserve forgiveness? That is, forgiveness with the undertones of absolution for decades of neglect and abuse. As if that isn't enough, after she was 13 and he had assaulted her, she told him if he ever touched her again, she was going straight to the cops, so he killed himself. And her mother blamed Sarah for her uncle taking his life. But that brings me to another common message with these undertones in forgiveness. That is, forgiveness for the aggressor isn't for the aggressor, it's for yourself. But that is a hard sell, because why wouldn't you be furious about having your entire life derailed because your mother served you up on a silver platter to a pedophile for 9 years and then blamed you for his death? There's a lot of pithy sayings about that, such as anger or resentment is like drinking poison expecting the other person to die, which is a quote attributed to numerous people. Why should anyone, let alone Sarah, have ever tried to find forgiveness or acceptance for those terrible actions? Well, because Sarah's mother didn't give a fuck then, and she doesn't give a fuck now. Last I heard, she was mad at Sarah for making her look like a bad mother by killing herself, which does not surprise me at all. I would have been more surprised if her mother hadn't made herself the victim. Since I found out about Sarah's passing, I've found myself in a position where I need to attempt to find forgiveness for her mother and acceptance for the situation. Before she died, I was just angry for Sarah, but could manage to smile and act friendly to her mother to just be around her. After, I saw her randomly in the grocery store one day. She smiled at me, gave me a little wave, and I saw red. I had to abandon my groceries and walk out because I could feel my brain sliding into a bad place in real time. I knew if I stayed or tried to interact with her, it wasn't going to end well. And for my neurodivergent, low or no empathy folks, I'm not angry because I was wrong. I'm angry for Sarah. I'm angry for the life that she didn't get to enjoy hardly ever, for the people that she loved and that loved her, for who she could have been if her life wasn't a constant struggle from start to finish. Am I angry at her uncle? Yeah, but not as much. He was a child molester. He was a predator, and it was in his nature to hunt for the vulnerable to fulfill his needs at their expense. It's not hard for me to accept that a pedophile did pedophile things. That's what he felt compelled to do, so that's what he did. On the other hand, her mother made the choice many, many times over to protect and enable the abuse of her daughter. She wasn't afraid of her brother, not intimidated by him. Sarah's mother loved her brother a lot and had to have known the kind of guy he was. It would be impossible to deny after Sarah tried to come forward the first time. But then comes a difficult question. What does that anger actually mean? What does it do for me? What good does it do? It just sits there like a poison in my stomach, burning and tainting my own peace and happiness. As someone who spent a long time angry, resentful, and spiteful, I don't want that poison in my stomach any longer than it needs to be. One common piece of advice that people give about that is to channel the anger into something productive. The problem is that doesn't resolve the anger or difficult emotions. It's a form of avoidance. I'm going to focus on doing this other thing instead of attempting to find a way to actually process and let go of these feelings. For example, pour your anger and energy into the chin. Well, that will definitely burn energy, and it can help with emotional regulation, but that doesn't help you process and release the core pain. It's another form of avoidance because you're treating the symptom and not addressing the root cause. Now, that's often better because I'm approaching the situation with a clear mind, untainted by that extra energy. The other issue is that my anger issues are so tightly interwoven with depression and bipolar disorder. It fuels instability, which creates a cycle where it keeps feeding itself, like Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. I don't have the luxury of just letting it sit and waiting for it to go away, because it could rocket me into an unwell cycle that could last for weeks or months. So, let me share with you how I approach forgiving difficult people in situations in my life, and how I'm approaching this problem now so that I don't have to hold on to the anger, I hope. There are two ideas that I believe to be the foundation of my ability to take things as they come and to practice forgiveness and acceptance. The first comes from the American Psychological Association, and that is the literal definition of the word trauma. It goes as follows, as borrowed from the APA's dictionary website. Quote, trauma is any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or other disruptive feelings intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effect on a person's attitudes, behavior, and other aspects of functioning. Traumatic events include those caused by human behavior, e.g. rape, war, industrial accidents, as well as by nature, e.g. earthquakes, and often challenge an individual's view of the world as a just, safe, and predictable place. Now I hear that and I think, what is life but an ongoing collection of traumatic experiences? How many times have I felt fear, helplessness, confusion, or disruptive feelings that screwed with my functioning for a long time? Several times. Psychotic breaks, losing people I care about, suicide and overdose, bad breakups, abusive relationships, violence, my own suicide attempts, losing jobs, health problems, and the current social and political climate. However, that shouldn't be confused with PTSD. Not everyone who has a traumatic experience will develop PTSD, but there are a lot of people who hear the word trauma and automatically associate the two. Trauma is an event or experience. PTSD is a potential result of the event. Now, in many cases, with early intervention and social support, a person can work through the traumatic experiences and lessen the long-term implications. However, some people get stuck and they're not able to stumble their way through resolution. But if someone gets stuck on a natural path of healing, they may end up going around in circles instead of making forward progress. At that point, one needs professional help from a therapist who can help with the trauma. Now, because of the association that people make between lowercase t trauma and PTSD, I find that the average person tends to only focus on the most blatant examples. Like, no reasonable person questions a combat vet or a sexual assault survivor who's traumatized by their experiences. But then I think back to the literal definition, paraphrased down a bit. That is, trauma is any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or other disruptive feelings intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effect on a person's attitudes, behavior, and other aspects of functioning. I would be willing to bet that most everyone can come up with at least one example of an experience like that in their life. And if you can't, well, you will, sooner or later. Because even in the best case scenario where life is smooth and happy, sooner or later our loved ones will die, and we have to navigate that absence and pain. And death can certainly traumatize the people left behind. And that speaks to another common saying, be kind because you have no idea what anyone else is going through, because you truly don't. Now, the second block in the foundation comes from the philosophy of Stoicism, and the whole idea is best expressed through this quote from Marcus Aurelius. Quote, begin each day by telling yourself, today I should be meeting with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness, all of them due to the offender's ignorance of what is good or evil. End quote. For that to make sense, you need to understand that the Stoics viewed virtue as the sole good. Virtue being to act with justice, compassion, wisdom, and moderation. It's a simple enough idea, but not at all shallow or easy. It's hard. It's hard because we're all just trying to get through this ongoing traumatic experience that is life, trying to party like it's 1999, and our perceptions are constantly shifting because of our experiences and the information we're receiving. It's easy to make the wrong choices or do bad things from a lack of understanding. It's easy to make the wrong choices when you're just trying to survive or haven't seen any other way to make better choices. Many people don't realize how much harm they're doing to themselves by doing the wrong things. I think back to all the years I spent angry and selfish. I think of all the things that my wrong actions ruined for me. Relationships, jobs, friendships, opportunities. I then have to approach myself with radical honesty because many of those actions that I took were because I was mentally unwell and emotionally unstable. In many cases, I didn't make the choice. My mental illness made the choice for me through my distorted perception of the world, impulsiveness, and my own trauma. But then, many weren't. I have low empathy, which is a byproduct of the autism. My empathy works backwards, like I can look at a bad situation or do a wrong thing and feel little about it. It's only when I consider the situation that I can start feeling emotions associated with it. And then you have other circumstances where I knew I was doing the wrong thing and I chose to do it anyway, out of selfishness or short-sightedness, or just because I wanted to, because fuck it. The certain actions I can attribute to unwellness, but others were just the result of my acting on my conditioning and what I believed about the world. I was steeped in toxic masculinity and heavily influenced by pro-capitalist attitudes, particularly working in marketing. For a while, I developed an attitude to win at all costs and make as much money as I could, because that's what you're supposed to do, right? I'm a man, I'm supposed to provide, might makes right, and if they're too soft to compete or take advantage of, then fuck them. That isn't the way I was raised, but I wound up lost and disconnected because I couldn't make sense of the world around me because of my mental disorders and social conditioning. For as much as I was told to be kind and understanding, it sure seemed like a lot of people preaching about it weren't. And as I started in therapy and recovery, I started to dissect the way my actions have rippled through the world, which dovetails nicely into another quote I want to share with you from the renowned esteemed poet and philosopher DMX, who said in his song, Let Me Fly, quote, there's a difference between doing wrong and being wrong, unquote. And what is that difference? Well, the way I interpret it is like this. To do wrong is to know the difference between right and wrong and still choose to do the wrong action. To be wrong is to be unaware that your action is wrong when you're doing it. And it's what you do after you understand the wrong that matters most. So when someone wrongs me or I'm looking at someone who's done wrong, I try to see the motive. Why did they do what they did? Did they do it out of maliciousness? Is it something that they did to learn how to survive their own ongoing traumatic experience? Do I even have enough context to tell the difference? In my mind, it's not too hard for me to find forgiveness and acceptance for bad actions when someone isn't aware of the harm they're causing, or it's out of their control. I know from my own life how much harm they're doing to themselves by acting badly. I know how much they are losing when they are cruel or selfish, undermining their own peace and happiness by creating more problems for themselves. That, however, ties in another problem with forgiveness, particularly the phrase forgive and forget. This phrase has been twisted by the selfish to weaponize it against the people that they have wronged. That phrase assumes a mistake and good intentions behind the mistake. But what if there weren't good intentions? Should you just forget then? No, because that would be short-sighted. Like, if a friend says something that hurts my feelings and they weren't intending to, all it takes is an apology to resolve it. They apologize, I forgive them, I let it go, and I'll never bring it up again. I'll forget it. I won't load it over them. I won't bring it up a year later and say, hey, do you remember when you did this? But on the other hand, if they were to do the same thing again, I'm angry because they repeated the harmful behavior even after they knew not to. They happen to be wrong in the first action, but in the second, they chose to repeat the harmful action, which crossed one of my boundaries. So again, we run into the imperfect nature of words and the divide between a literal definition and everyday use. Because if we go by the literal definition, then I wouldn't be thinking about it at all. It would just be off in the past somewhere, and that's where it will remain. Then when it's repeated, now I have to ask what's actually going on. Do they not respect my boundaries or my feelings? And how do they respond? Was it a genuine accident? People forget things. It happens. But was it maliciousness aimed to disrupt my peace? Were they trying to hurt me? If it was the latter, then there's a much bigger problem, because then it's about respect and boundaries and not just a mistake. So the phrase forgive and forget is for benign situations, accidents when someone doesn't mean to cause harm. They apologize, they change their behavior, and everyone moves on. It's a phrase to remind the person who is wrong not to constantly be bringing it up later to use as a weapon against the other person. And if I'm not ready to let something go, then I don't forgive them. I tell them I'm not ready to and need more time to process or determine the motive behind the wrong. Now, my personal rule is that I don't forgive anyone until I feel there's an appropriate resolution, which entails making the damage whole again, and I'm no longer angry. That is, if they broke something, fix it. Or if they did something wrong, I expect them to not do it again. Now, that doesn't work in every situation, but it works in most. And that is the same standard I hold myself to as much as I can. If I wrong someone, I will try and fix it if I can. But what about the people that won't or can't? Now, I look at Sarah's mother, what I know about her, what I witnessed with my own eyes, and I wonder what brought her to the point that she's at. Her mother is a two-faced, sweet as can be in public, and awful behind closed doors. I would be willing to bet money that she would be diagnosed as a malignant capital N narcissist if she were to ever acknowledge that something might be wrong with her, but that would be infallible to her. Where does that level of narcissism come from? Well, there are several factors that can contribute, but a big one is early childhood trauma. I only heard bits and pieces about Sarah's grandfather, but it certainly sounded like he was a pedophile too. And with some of the things that her mother said, it was almost stereotypical. For example, telling a 7-year-old that you must have done something to lead him on. Then you had other things that didn't have much explanation behind them. Why did she feel the need to get blackout drunk almost every night of the week on cheap vodka? What about the wreckage of romantic relationships she had? Or the fact that she always expressed how stupid it was to show emotion to anyone? I have to wonder what made her that way. Though I will never know, what I do know is that it couldn't be good. Then I try to consider what kind of suffering was inflicted on her and how much she inadvertently inflicted on herself because of her own trauma and mental illness. No close friends, no happy relationships, no real emotional intimacy, and none of her adult kids really wanted to be around her at all. You know, I have a personal rule where I try never to pity anyone because I think it's dehumanizing and doesn't respect people as individuals capable of their own agency. But I can't help but find myself pitying her mother at times because I know enough to understand that she didn't choose to be this way. What a lonely, painful life she must lead. A life that was imposed on her as a child. I wonder if her mother did the same thing to her. Told her it was her fault, that she needed to cover up more skin, to not be alone with her uncle, while simultaneously leaving Sarah alone with her uncle to babysit. That she, a child, must have done something to seduce a grown man. But on the other hand, Sarah's dead, and her mother was one of the main contributors to that. What does forgiveness mean in that situation? Would it mean absolution and resolution? Absolutely not. Not unless she could somehow take responsibility for her decades of choices of how she harms Sarah. And how do you balance those scales? And I don't think you can. That brings me to the final piece of this puzzle. One of the hardest things I've had to learn in life is how to hold two opposites as truth. My autistic brain hates it so much because it wants to default into seeing the world in black and white, one thing or another. But it's not. Very, very few things are. Her mother was undoubtedly a victim of some terrible things, and at the same time did terrible things that contributed to her daughter's long-term suffering, alcoholism, and suicide. Part of me wants to hate her because I feel like the hatred would be justified and righteous. But at the same time, she doesn't give a shit, and I'll never speak to her again, hopefully. So I have to forgive her, because I have to accept it so I'm not consumed by my own anger, the pain of loss, and my anger for Sarah. But also for whatever her mother's life could have been had she not been victimized too. And to repeat the quote from Marcus Aurelius, begin each day by telling yourself, today I shall be meeting with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness, all of them due to the offender's ignorance of what is good or evil. I don't think her mother has any concept of what good or evil can be. I don't know if she's even capable of it, because she certainly never seemed capable of self-reflection or taking responsibility for anything. She lives in her own little world based on her own perceptions, and everyone else is wrong or an enemy if they don't agree. When I find my anger simmering and starting to boil about her, I also try to think about these humanizing qualities. How could she know any better with how she's wired? How could she have known her daughter would eventually take her life? How could she have reasonably got help with how bad stigma used to be surrounding mental illness, particularly for women, particularly for sexual assault? Hell, look how bad it is still now. I find that if I focus on those humanizing aspects, it helps to reduce my anger. I found out that Sarah died sometime in like mid-2025-ish. I can't remember exactly. The anger I feel has receded a lot, but I don't know if it'll ever go away. I don't know if I ever do want it to completely go away. I feel like someone should be angered for Sarah, and someone who knew her better than most. But I don't know. Maybe that's not the right approach either. She's dead, and I hope the issues she had in this life are no longer her concern. But they are still my concern, because I have to figure out what to do with this poison that burns in my belly and wants to get out. So if you find yourself in a position where people are telling you that you need to forgive anything, understand that forgiveness does not mean absolution. It does not free the person from the responsibility of their actions unless you feel it does. That's for you to decide for yourself. You don't owe that to anybody. I may accept that her mother wasn't capable of taking right action or self-evaluating due to her own life experiences, but that doesn't make it okay. It doesn't absolve the damage caused by your choices. And if you need that anger to keep going, I understand. Spite, anger, and resentment carried me through a lot of dark times in my life. But I have to say, as someone that's been decades angry, it gets old after a while. It was a fire that just burned and burned and burned until I felt like a husk of a human being. I had to find a way to let it go, or it was going to kill me. Forgiveness does not have to mean absolution. Acceptance is a better word. I accept that this life is a clusterfuck for a lot of people, and a lot of people do wrong things, including myself. I accept that a lot of people are driven to unkind actions from their own trauma and suffering, and they won't be rational. And most importantly, I accept that wrong actions do serious harm to the people that are committing them. If they knew any better, why would they do them? If you knew an action was going to hurt you, would you still do it? And I know that a lot of people are angry with their loved one when they take their life. Your feelings are valid. I know people tend to tell you that you shouldn't be angry at them, but anger is part of grief. And trauma isn't rational, and losing someone to suicide is certainly a traumatic experience. But I'm not angry at Sarah. She carried an impossible load for 4 decades, mostly by herself. Why would she have chosen that route if she truly had the ability to choose, and wasn't so heavily influenced by the pain she was carrying? That's not a decision she would have made if she hadn't been carrying that trauma and harm from her childhood and life. I just hope that she has the peace and happiness now that she was deprived of in this life. Now, I thought a lot about whether or not to add this last part, but after some thought, I feel like I'm supposed to. I also regularly apply this method of thinking to people who are leaving MAGA. MAGA is the result of decades of propaganda from bad actors to cover up horrific things and seizing power. It's the result of billions of dollars of research, advertising, strategizing, propaganda, and effort by white Christian nationalists to steal this country. It's the result of regularly defunding education to kill critical thinking skills and making a whole lot of people angry by forcing them to live in poverty and ongoing traumatic experience. That is, the people that just genuinely aren't full-blown racists. Stage was set for Trump and how unseriously we would take the outrage that their propagandists create the environment for. I believe that when they blew up about Obama wearing a tan suit, Dan Quayle misspelling potato, and Howard Dean's screen, that they were specifically paving the way to create plausible deniability for someone like Trump. Maybe not Trump specifically, not as far back as the 90s, but whatever candidate the white Christian nationalists would eventually put forward. Remember, this plan has been in action for a long time. Then they could convince the average white person that it was just politics and absurdity, no big deal when they started talking about terrible things. That became much easier with their propaganda networks and online influencing campaigns. Many of their motives are buried under absurdity. Then you have the shock that so many white folks are dealing with now, talking about how this isn't the country they grew up in or the country that they know. And the only reason they don't know is because we've been drowned in propaganda and the idea of white exceptionalism from the start, something that people repeat constantly without thinking about it. Like telling black folks that they need to work on black crime, or what about Chicago? All right, what about funding the schools appropriately in those areas? What about creating jobs and avenues to jobs to help these kids see they can actually have a future? What about funding community centers and after-school activities? What about funding breakfast and lunch for our kids? What exactly should black folks do to change all these things? As someone that spent most of my life living in a very red area, few relate to or understand because of how well insulated these areas are. It would be damn difficult for the average person who doesn't have great critical thinking skills to see through the centuries of propaganda and psychological warfare that has been waged against white men to make us compliant, expendable tools of oppression. Now, as someone that's worked in marketing, one of the things that I've come to understand about people is that it's really easy to get someone to care about something. What's hard is making them care enough about something to want to inconvenience themselves. Like back when I was a kid, we had the sponsor an African child commercials. You had a kindly looking white man in pristine white clothing and sandals, a perfect metaphor of white saviorism. He's standing in a dirty ass village with starving people around him, hunger on full display, with that one kid who had that fly that kept landing on his eyeball but never blinked. And at the time I thought, wow, that's really heavy-handed. But after working in marketing and working in fundraising a couple of times, yeah, it has to be heavy-handed. You can't just stick the knife in. That'll only make someone care and think, oh, that's too bad. But that's not good enough. That's not enough to put money or man hours into the organization to accomplish their goals. You have to stick the knife in and twist it ever so slowly until you make them uncomfortable enough to spur them to action. If you go too far, it's a turnoff, and the person will withdraw. Dr. King and Malcolm X both touched on this bit of consumer psychology, talking about the white moderate and liberals who value peace over justice. They've never had to be that uncomfortable, never had to truly see it for what it is until now. It was easy to write off as being traumatic or ignored because it didn't affect them. They could think, oh, that's too bad, and then they could just move on and change the channel or wait for the show to come back on. Then you combine that with a long-standing nurturing of individualism and selfishness that's been cultivated in advertising and public relations since Edward Bernays, the father of public relations. He's one of the pioneers of manipulating emotions and perceptions to drive sales rather than focus on product features. There's a good Adam Curtis documentary about him on YouTube. If you have 4 hours, I highly suggest that you watch it. America as a whole in our current social and political climate will make a lot more sense once you do. A lot of the messages of rugged individualism that's been aimed at straight white males is heavily rooted in that, weaponizing male pride, ego, and insecurity. Even the most iconic image of rugged individualism of America is propaganda, the white cowboy. Because exactly how many black or Hispanic cowboys have you ever seen in media, particularly back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s? I mean, there was what, Blazing Saddles? Now, I tried to dig up some statistics on the matter, but found inconsistent answers. Some claim that about 1 in 4 were people of color, which would include Hispanics. But others claim that 25% were black, but 33% were Hispanic and Native Americans, which seems more reasonable. I feel like that still might be understated considering the number of whites that must have been present versus the Native people, but that's just speculation. Now, even the root image of the cowboy isn't inspired from white people. The word cowboy evolved from vaquero, which originated from Spain. Vaquero is Spanish for cattle herder. When they came over, they spread their methodologies to other cattlemen and ranchers, including Mexicans. Then vaquero would eventually become cowboy because white people. And if you're white and thinking, not everything is about race and racism, I'm pretty confident this was. I mean, the Hispanics were perfectly fine with being called vaqueros since they used that word for like hundreds of years before that. But I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that white men from the 19th century wouldn't want to be called a Spanish word for their job title. Now to circle back to those who are leaving MAGA. Can I blame the people who are unaware? Can I blame the people who didn't look at Trump's behavior and brush it off as nonsense because they weren't aware enough to understand that he was serious the whole time? That many of the people around him and those supporting his legislation weren't just dupes when they said one thing and did another? Should I be angry about the people that fell prey to a machine that's been oiled with blood and money for decades? Centuries even? I don't want to be, because I don't think it's hopeful. And like I already touched on, I can't live in that anger all the time without losing my mind. If I do that, then I can't help because I know my anger will make me impulsive and easy to manipulate. I have to hold the two truths similarly. That these people who supported and facilitated Trump caused irreparable harm to this country. And many of them who aren't just white nationalists are victims too. I think back to all the harm that I suffered and inflicted on myself, buying into the bullshit narratives of what it means to be a straight white man in America, and how much judgment I would pass on other people. But I'm also a severely mentally ill man, and we know what the white nationalists think of people like us. That was evident when Brian Kilmeade said they should just kill us with an involuntary lethal injection on Fox News, and few on the right even batted an eyelash at it. No one on that newscast even looks slightly put off or uncomfortable, so I can see what my future will be if they're able to fully enact their plans. I recall a while ago that someone was quoted as saying, quote, Mr. Trump said that if it was up to Mr. Miller, there would be only 100 million people in this country, and they would all look like Mr. Miller, end quote. That stood out to me because I remember that number from an old conspiracy theory when I was deep in those rabbit holes years ago. Except I think it was about optimal population target to stabilize the use of national resources after a cataclysmic event, rather than what we have going on now. However, I cannot remember or find which theory it was, though. If you happen to know, do reach out and point me in the right direction, if you would. Now, even though I'm a straight white man, I'm still mentally ill, and I know they'll do to us what the Nazis did to the mentally ill and disabled. Empty the asylums, shot in shallow trenches, or euthanized, because taking care of vulnerable people isn't profitable or preferable for people focused on purity. I am impure, despite my whiteness. And with that bit of information, it opens up a whole lot more context. Why haven't the Republicans been able to come up with a healthcare plan in 15 years? Why did they got the CDC, FEMA? Why were they perfectly okay with sacrificing the disabled and the elderly for the economy during COVID? Why do they not care about denying SNAP benefits and making people go hungry? Why are they buying up warehouses for detention camps for a lot more people? Why do they support genocide? The actions of the white nationalists sure make a whole lot more sense with that additional context. They just want us to die, but they can't shove us all in ovens. But on the other hand, there's a difference between doing wrong and being wrong. Now that many are waking up and are figuring out something is up, it would be short-sighted for me to fling my anger at them and turn them away. My anger isn't more important than ensuring that they may not be able to carry out the full scope of whatever their true plans may be. So I have to find a way to deal with my anger myself so I can remain objective. That certainly doesn't mean forget, and an apology is definitely not enough. The only viable apology now is action to obstruct and unmake this monster. An apology without action is meaningless. It's just hollow words. Anyone can say anything. And if you're white and this is all new and shocking to you, stop trying to offload the emotional labor of your fear and regret onto people of color. They've been living with this for centuries. You were just oblivious to it because the machine was built to convince you that the struggles of people of color are due to a lack of character, rather than playing in a rigged game. Take action. Do something in whatever capacity you're able to. Every small bit of resistance gums up the machine. You'll have better luck asking for absolution and resolving your guilt after this is all said and done, when you have action and change behavior to back it up. And if not, well, I guess I'll see you in the concentration warehouses when they start locking us up en masse. After all, they view race traitors as even less than people of color. You shouldn't be shocked about Alex Preddy, Renee Good, or any other white person who gets murdered in all this. If you support or mingle with other races that don't fit the white nationalist narrative, you're a race traitor, and they can't have you poisoning the perception of other white people. Quote, there's a difference between doing wrong and being wrong. End quote. It's what you do after you realize that you were wrong that matters most. Whether that's wrong actions in your personal life or waking up to the current social and political situation. Thank you for your time. Hit subscribe if you haven't, and share this with someone if you think it might help them. You can find this episode in article format on my free Substack. Link is in the show notes.